Hello and welcome to Indie April. I'm going to kick off today by talking about my first ever novel, or the first novel that I ever wrote, called Lucid. This is the original version published in 2009, and this one was a re-release in 2012. Slightly different size and cover. Now I'm gonna press through this. It might start raining because we're in the middle of the rainy season here in Rwanda. It tends to rain a lot, so that might happen. I've also got a bit of a stuffy nose because I've got allergies. Everybody gets them when it rains. But I'm going to press ahead because according to the weather forecast, there is no good time to do this week. So it's going to be raining all week, so I might as well get on with it. So I've got my cup of tea, which is getting a little bit cold actually. I might have to get another one. And I'm good to go. So what happened? Well, I think every author, every writer has got that moment where they sit down in their life and they go, I wonder if I could write a novel. Most of us, we start out writing short stories, we dabble in a bit of poetry, and then there does come that day when you sit down and you go, could I write something longer? Would it be any good? How do I know if I don't try? And for me, that came around 2008. So I moved to Rwanda in 2007. I was a volunteer sign language researcher with voluntary services overseas. So that's like the British version of Peace Corps. They take professionals from the UK and around the world and send them out to places where skill share is necessary and required and has been asked for. And in my case, the Rwandan National Union of the Deaf had requested somebody to come and help them. To develop the first dictionary of Rwandan Sign Language, or Amarenga Ikinyarwanda. And I put my hand up and went, yeah, I'd do that. So I've actually done a different video all about how that happened. And you can go and watch that if you're interested. But the upshot of it was that I was living in this gorgeous little round hut in Kismente in Kigali. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. It was knocked down many years ago. But it was a delightful place. I was living there with I think I had my cats by that point. But what I didn't have were any books, because books were extremely expensive at that time, very hard to find. Even today, there are not that many bookshops in Kigali and books are expensive. So there was, at the VSO headquarters just down the road, there was an entire room, ceiling to floor, of books that volunteers had just left there over the years. You know, they brought them, it was usually fiction, but there was a bit of non-fiction in there. There were books from all over the place. And as volunteers, you could pop in. But beyond what was available in that room, there wasn't that much to read. I didn't have a radio. I didn't have a television. I still don't by choice today. And back then, the internet was a very, very different ball game. It was incredibly slow and incredibly expensive. You had to buy data bundles, and you could easily spend sort of $10 every couple of days trying to top up your internet. Unlike today, when I have broadband, Netflix exists, a whole load of things exist now that really didn't back then, to distract you from your writing, which it does, unfortunately. But anyway, I was sitting there in my little house, and I had a lot of time in the evenings when I wasn't doing anything else. And that's when I sat down for the first time to find out if I could hit that word count. I think the longest short story I'd ever written in the past was about 11,000 words. And I wanted to try and hit 70,000. I kind of considered that to be about the level for a novel. Now, stats for nerds, I did actually hit 92,000 was the final manuscript. That came down to about 88 for the book. And I think I lost maybe another couple of thousand in the final re-release. But that was how I came to be writing my first novel. Now, how did I choose the topic and what is Lucid about? Now, I did give you a bit of a warning before when I did the intro video to Indie April. I write very dark stories. I write dark fiction, I write dark fantasy, dark historical fiction. As you can... We'll talk about the cover a bit later on. We will talk about the cover a bit later on. But as you can probably, guess from the way that looks, it's a dark story. And I think the reason that it's such a dark story is I grew up loving horror. I bond with my dad very closely on that. We love horror films and the horror genre. So, I grew up reading Stephen King, I grew up reading Sean Hudson, James Herbert, Ian Watson's Meat. I really like that genre. And so I think for every author, the genre that you really enjoy reading is usually where you start when you start writing, is you want to try and emulate that kind of style, panache, to sort of generate the things that you enjoy consuming. So that's why the darkness kind of comes in with this first book, and why I kind of edged a little bit towards the horror genre. But again, I'm going to go into that a bit later on, because it's kind of borderline, to me, it's kind of borderline horror sci-fi. There's a sort of scientific element to it, because the topic that I decided to pick up on was one that I was really fascinated by. So growing up, I loved everything occult. I loved everything to do with fortune telling, mystery, that kind of, chills down the spine kind of thing. And I had quite an extensive library that I was collecting. I'd go around bookshops and I buy books on that kind of thing. And I remember my mum's partner Merrick, when he first moved in, he brought some books with him. And one of those books was a book called Be Here Now by Richard Alpert. Now, many people know Richard Alpert as Baba Ram Dass. There was an entire Netflix documentary on him, so you can go and check that out if you like. But the very, very abbreviated version of Baba Ram Dass is that, he went off to travel the world to figure out what life was about, and he discovered psychedelics. And through psychedelics, he eventually discovered Buddhism. It's a very long story, but it really captured my imagination. And when I created my first ever website in my teenage years, it was called Raining Gaia's Tears, because I was also a bit into Lovelock at that point. And I think the first thing I did was write out Be Here Now on the website for other people to read, because you were allowed to. It was a shareable book at that time, sort of very early Creative Commons, before Creative Commons came along. And that's how much I was fascinated by this story, as I wanted to share it with other people. But then later on, through good friends, and a good friend Paul in particular, I kind of came to read things like Stanislav Grof and the McKenna brothers. And there's a really good book actually called From Chocolate to Morphine, which goes into the science of how everything from sort of the food we eat to recreational drugs chemically affects our bodies, and the actual interaction that has, and why we experience what we experience from those things. Chocolate to Morphine, good book. So I was just consuming anything I could read about this, because I was also one of those kooky kids. I was interested in lucid dreaming. I was interested in all of these things, sleep paralysis. And really the whole thing came together in this particular book, because I think when we sit down to write our first novel, we pick something that we're really interested in. Because if you're going to get to the end of 50,000, 70,000, 90,000 words, you've got to really enjoy what you're talking about. You've got to feel like there's enough material in there to get there. Because the first time that you ever write a book of that length, it is a marathon. It is often a marathon. I wouldn't say it gets much easier after that, but... I was really fascinated by that. And in my research, the particular part that really drew me in, kind of got my attention and went, oh, this is interesting, is the relationship between psychedelics and normal dreaming, the way that we dream every night. So I'm going to explain the science behind lucid as I understood it back then. So this was around 2008, 2009. So our understanding of the biology of psychedelics has probably progressed a bit since then. But if I explain it as I understood it, then you'll kind of understand how the story unfolded a bit better, a bit more clearly. So I was really quite fascinated, as I said, between the relationship between psychedelics or external entheogens, external psychedelics used in sort of shamanic rituals and cultural events, and the relationship between that and how we dream. So in South America, there is a psychoactive preparation called ayahuasca. Now, ayahuasca is made up of two plants, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of both of them. So, Psychotria viridea and Banisteriopsis carpi. Now, Psychotria contains DMT, dimethyltryptamine, and DMT is possibly one of the strongest hallucinogenic substance known to man. However, it isn't active in the body. It doesn't have an effect on the body unless it's combined with something called a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, or MAOI. Not that really shortens it much. So if you just take the DMT on its own, not a lot's going to happen. You're not going to notice much going on. But if you combine it with the second plant, the Banisteriopsis carpi, then suddenly it's activated and your brain lights up like a glowworm. And then people are off traveling on their spirit journeys. And if you're interested in this, do check out an artist called Pablo Amarengo. You can just Google Pablo Amarengo and see his artwork. Unfortunately, he's passed on now, but he used to paint the visions that he had on ayahuasca, and the paintings are just absolutely incredible, really, really beautiful. So that's how the preparation works on the body and how it creates psychoactive effects. The fun side fact here is carpi also includes the MAOI harmaline. And harmaline was, when it was first discovered by early pharmacists, also was given the name telepathine. There is actually a chemical that pharmacists sat down and said, yep, we're going to call that telepathine because it appears to create telepathic experiences. And again, if you're reading a lot of, first-person accounts of psychedelic experiences, quite a few of them include sort of telepathic experiences, either with other human beings or the ability to understand the emotions and thoughts of animals more clearly, which I think is just, I find that entertaining, that the world of science actually gave the name telepathine to a compound. Anyway, that's just the way my brain works. Or doesn't. But moving on. So we understand how an external entheogenic preparation affects the body and creates a psychedelic experience. But the part that I was always really interested in was the fact that, so DMT, which I mentioned is perhaps one of the most psychoactive compounds that we've ever encountered as a species, is actually a byproduct of our own digestive system and respiratory system. And that our body actually creates this chemical itself internally, endogenously. Now, you might reasonably be thinking, well, if DMT is present in the body, why are we not permanently tripping? Why are we not walking around in a constant state of heightened awareness or otherworldliness? Well, because the second part of that is required to make DMT active, the MAOI, the monoamine oxidase inhibitor, is missing. It's not present until we go to sleep. At which point, the melatonin, which makes us sleepy in the evenings, when the sun goes down, our body starts to produce melatonin and we start to get a bit drowsy. And when we go to sleep, the science as I understood it back then, and again, as I say, we might know more now, was that there's a tiny little gland called the pineal gland in the middle of our foreheads. Pineal because it's shaped like a pine cone. And this little pineal gland takes some of that melatonin and converts it into something called pinolin. And pinolin is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Now, it's called a reversible monoamine oxidase inhibitor because it's reversed by daylight. So generally, it's only produced in a dark environment. So usually at night time when we're sleeping. And when the sun rises and sunlight hits the face, it stops production. And then our body gets ready to wake up and go off to work. But that does kind of explain dreams quite well, if you think about it, and if that science is correct, that, you know, if the MAOI is activating the DMT in your system, that does kind of explain why dreams are so weird and wacky and so realistic. You know, again, if you're looking at accounts of people on psychedelics, there are so many similarities. You're having visions or hallucinations that are so vivid that they seem real. You are having highs and lows. So, you know, with psychoactive experiences, people can have extreme swings of emotion. You can have an upper or a downer. You can be in a beautiful realm or a hellish one. As with dreams, you can have a beautiful dream or you can have a nightmare. Time tends to slip. So when people talk about tripping, when they're talking about a psychedelic experience, they find it very difficult to say how long they've been on that experience. So they could feel like, you know, a few hours stretches into millennia or you know, billions of years. They could see the creation of Earth and the destruction of Earth and everything in between. Or, you know, it could go by extremely quickly. And that's the same with dreams. You know, you fall asleep in your chair and you wake up and maybe you were only asleep for a couple of minutes, but you've been on a dream that went on for hours. Or maybe you've been sleeping for several hours and you wake up the next day, maybe you haven't dreamed that much and it feels like you just closed your eyes a minute ago. So time gets a bit slippy. What else? The ability to remember dreams and psychedelic experiences is kind of ephemeral. You know, a lot of times people report not really being able to remember all of the details, or, you know, they come down and everything's still very, very vivid, and within a couple of hours it's all gone a bit hazy. Same with dreams. You can wake up from a dream and it can be an epic dream and you think that you remember every single detail of that dream, and then you try and recount it to somebody later on in the day and I don't know, it had a seagull in it. I'm not too sure. Maybe something to do with the ocean. Who knows? Gone. So, you know, there are a lot of similarities, experiential similarities between sort of the dream state as we know it every night and the dream state that people induce using psychedelics. And I find that very, very interesting because, you know, even somebody who is a complete teetotaler, never drinks, never smokes, has never touched drugs in their life, if this science is kind of anywhere near accurate, would still be flying high as a kite alongside the Siberian shamans and the ayahuascaras of South America every single night of their life. It's something that unites every single human being, because there isn't a human being that doesn't dream. I don't think there is. If there is, let me know. I'd be interested. We might not remember our dreams, but that's very different to not actually dreaming. It's a basic human function that every night we clean out our brains using the chemicals that we get when we're dreaming. So yeah, really the only difference there between dreaming at night time when we're sleeping and psychedelic experiences of dreaming is that one's happening in the daylight and the other's not. Although when you look at the cultural use of psychedelics, they are almost entirely used from evening onwards. So, you know, you don't tend to take them during the daytime. So, yeah, that really fascinated me. Just that spark of an idea that, these two things are really similar. And I really didn't have much more to go on plot-wise with that at that moment. But it was kind of one of those sort of ideas that just stuck in my head, trying to find a way out. And somewhere along the way, I discovered this BA thesis by a guy called George Ingram. I'm not sure if this is even still available online, but the title of it kind of stood out and I went, ooh, I need to read this, because it was called Dreaming as Precognition in Lowland South America. So lowland South America is kind of ayahuasca country, and the part about dreaming as precognition. So the thesis was looking at the difference in interpretation of dreams between Western culture and lowland South America. And it was really interesting because what I'd never really thought about before is, you know, in Western culture and Western philosophy and tradition, in large thanks to Freud and Jung, we really do consider dreams to be reflective. So dreams are often about how we process events that have happened to us, things that have happened to us in our daily life, our anxieties, our fears, you know, all of that kind of stuff. We're very much looking at the past to inform our dreams. So the iconography that we have in our dreams and sort of the images that we see in our dreams, we tend to try to relate back to something that's already happened to us. Now, it's been many, many, many years since I read this thesis, but if I do remember it correctly, what was very interesting and different about many other cultures outside of Western traditions is that they almost universally look at dreaming as precognition, as sort of foretelling the future, as it was. So rather than looking at their dreams and trying to relate it back to something that happened to them earlier in their lives or, you know, in the past few days, they look at it as warning signs and good omens for the days to come and the years to come. And I mean, it sounds kind of, yeah, obviously, when you think about it that way, but it kind of hit me as very interesting. Now, within this, there was also the idea that there are different types of dreams and different qualities of dreams. And so this thesis really did bleed into Lucid a bit and kind of informed the world building in that. Because there was the idea that, you know, sometimes a dream is just a dream, and sometimes dreamscape, as I call it, the background images or the places that you go in your dreams, sometimes that is just dreamscape. It's got no other particular relevance or meaning. It's just sort of filler. But every now and again, you might encounter dreams that have a different function. So in his thesis, he talked about Karampar dreams. Let me just... K-A-R-A-M-P-R-A-R, Karampar dreams. And I think the way that was explained was a direct communion of souls. So it's not just your average dream that passes by and, you know, whatever. It's a moment of communication between yourself and something greater than yourself in that dream. And I found that very, very interesting. I don't know if the thesis is still available online. If I can find it, I will link to it below. But anyway, that really did inform, sort of, that gave me a world to work in where some things in a dream are just that, they're just background, and some things in a dream are real, are more tangible, have an actual function. And it's trying to tell the difference between those things. How do you tell the difference between those things? Anyway. So that was my personal fascination with this entire topic, and why I started out writing my first ever book about dreams and about psychedelics. And another little part of my life that kind of found its way into this book is that I set it in Cardiff. So Cardiff is the capital of Wales, and that's where I had been living for a few years by that point, up until the point where I left for Rwanda to join VSO. I actually spent several years working there, and then I went and did my master's degree at the University of Cardiff. So it was a city that I felt that I knew well. And I think, again, with your first books, it's not always that you write what you know, but you like to have something a bit familiar in there, so you're not constantly trying to work out if you've slipped up on something or you've written about something that doesn't exist, or, so it was a book written in the modern day. And I set it in modern day Cardiff because I knew modern day Cardiff. I knew where the parks were, I knew where the ponds were, I knew where the pubs were, I knew what the city centre looked like. So for me, that was something that I didn't have to worry about too much, whilst I was worrying about the whole science and plot fiction sort of layout of the actual plot. Now, I've spoken before about growing up in the pagan community in the UK, and that was very much a big part of my life in Cardiff. And that was something else that made its way into this book, because I sort of needed a sort of a hook between this crazy, surreal, psychedelic dreamland world and the modern day, everyday, getting up, going to work kind of world. Because the main character in this, Oliver Ryan, which obviously is the name of a character that you would call somebody in the first novel that you ever wrote. It sounds like somebody out of a spy thriller, Oliver Ryan. I got better at naming characters later down the line, but basically, he's a very ordinary bloke. He's a very ordinary bloke who just so happens to have really messed up dreams. And because of that, I needed a way to ease him into a world that made no sense. So I brought into this a Gwython. So a Gwython is, for Rwandans who are watching, a Gwython is a British version of an Umufumu. So it's Welsh witchcraft. So Wales is historically very, very well known for druids and druidism. Anglesey, or the island of Mona, used to be a seat of druidic knowledge and training. And so, there's a very long tradition of paganism in Wales. And so I brought in a character from that to kind of get involved in everything and help to interpret what was going on a bit, and just kind of walk that line between the surreal and the mundane. So that was fun. There was actually, there's a place called Tinkinswood, which is a standing stone just outside Cardiff. And every full moon, pretty much every full moon, I would drive out there and just lie on the capstone and look at the full moon. It was a very, very beautiful place. Very sort of isolated, but, every now and again you bump into somebody who was there as well, walking their dog, or, just out for a stroll. And towards the end of my time in Cardiff, I lived in an attic above a gypsy jazz musician. Long story. And Hilwyn, she was a fiddler. And, she came with me one night and we were lying on this capstone looking up at the moon. I was playing my tin whistle. She was playing her fiddle. It's just strange memories, beautiful memories. So again, it was a really good place to set a sort of strange, otherworldly book. And the landscape plays a big part in this story. Right, so that's why I kind of think of it as being a little bit more of a science fiction-y story than pure horror. There's more to it than just, ooh, scary, ooh, murder. It's not that kind of book. But having said that, it contains the ugliest character that I ever wrote. I know a lot of people, if you have read my work, I know a lot of people will probably say that Rosie Hours takes that prize, that Afsar is, a fairly cold-blooded, sociopathic, psychopathic killer. But I don't agree with that. I don't. And we'll talk about that more when we get on to Rosie Hours. But Afsar was a child. Or or at least she was a child when the story began. And to me, I guess I'm biased because I wrote her, but to me, she was understandable. Yeah, yes, she did some really horrific things, but I could see the reasoning there. I felt she was a very human character in that respect. Not likable, certainly not likable. She certainly wouldn't win any prizes for, best person of the year or anything, but I felt as a child with childhood fears, she was kind of understandable. Whereas this one, I wrote a character called Adrian Roy, and Adrian Roy is the big baddie in this one, and he to me is 1,000 times uglier in every respect, because Afsa had a few redeeming qualities, not many, but a few, and she was understandable to some extent, whereas Adrian Roy is not. He is pure brutal sadism, and I think I wrote him as a very unrestrained exercise in whether or not I could write pure horror, whether or not I could write somebody who was just the bogeyman. He is the bogeyman, in a very literal sense, and I kind of just wanted to see if I could, unrefined horror, and I think I pulled it off, because I think Adrian Roy is the stuff that nightmares are made of, and I think I did quite a good job of putting him together. Yeah, and he isn't understandable, really. I don't think you could understand him unless you were like him as a human being. If you were psychopathic, sociopathic, sadistic. And I know, sorry, I'm using that wrong. I've watched a lot of things over the years. Sociopath and psychopath are not the same thing. So let's go with psychopath there. Yeah, I think maybe then he would ring true. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm proud of having written that character, and if I was to write the book again, I might not have gone quite as all in as I did. But anyway, that's how I ended up with this cover. So, this was the third book that I ever got published, so it's kind of complicated. It gets a bit complicated. It was the first book I ever wrote to see whether or not I could meet the word count, and I did, and that was great. What was even better was I submitted to the Luke Bitmead Bursary for new writers. Now, the Luke Bitmead Bursary has got quite a heart-wrenching story. It's named after a young man called Luke Bitmead, who was an author. He'd written a couple of works, and he was about to have another book published. But he was suffering, I think, from depression. I'm not sure of the exact diagnosis, but he was suffering with some mental health problems, some mental health challenges, and he had attempted to take his life and been admitted to hospital, and unfortunately the hospital didn't keep him there, and they discharged him. Well, he discharged himself, and he walked to a multi-storey car park and he threw himself off the top, and so the bursary was set up by his parents in his name. So it was a really tragic story. I think he was only 34 when he died, and that was, it's a very sad story, and quite an incredible thing for his parents to do, to try to encourage other young writers in their son's name. And I submitted to that, as you do. You've written your first ever novel and you think, oh, it's either brilliant or it's awful, I don't know, because you haven't got really a reference point. Because, of course, your friends and family usually will tell you that whatever you've written is amazing because that's their job and they have to. But at the back of your mind, when you first write a novel, you want to test yourself. You want to know if a complete stranger thinks it's any good or would read it. That's kind of the litmus test, really. So I submitted to that, and I was shortlisted, and that kind of blew my little socks away at the time. how old would I have been? I'd be about 28, I guess. 28 when that happened in 2009. And I was actually invited to the awards ceremony, and I was gutted. I was gutted because, I was in Rwanda and I wouldn't be back in the UK for another year. So I couldn't really attend that. So I sent my apologies. But, the Luke Bitmead Bursary was incredible for me because, it was just a little nod of recognition that actually I might be okay at this. Having never written a novel before. I don't know if I'd ever had anything published before. Can't remember. But, to know that had been recognised by other people gave me a little spark. And that's why I went on to write the second novel, Angarichna, which I'll talk about in the next video. Because this one's getting a bit long, sorry. I'm going to wrap this up. So anyway, going back to The Darkness of Adrian Roy, that's how I ended up with this cover and why it looks so much like a horror novel. Now, to explain, the book was published by a publisher called Belvedere Publishing, but they are an imprint of Mirador. Now, Mirador are unabashedly a vanity publisher. So vanity publisher is a publishing house where they expect you to pay them to typeset and put out your book. So I would never have gone with a vanity publisher. I still wouldn't today because I believe that, either you have a publishing relationship with your publisher where, you're getting the royalties, or you self-publish and you keep that money. And I will go into this towards the end of Indie April. I might talk a little bit about the differences in how you can get published. But yeah, I would never have gone with Mirador, only their imprint Belvedere called me up and they said, we like this so much, we're not going to charge you anything, we just want to publish it. And, I was young and a bit naive and I was like, oh, you like me? You really like me? Yeah, go on then. And fair enough. It's a first time novel. It's not that polished. I probably wouldn't have got it published anywhere else. But what was a little bit disappointing is they weren't going to charge me to publish it, but they certainly weren't going to put any effort in either. They didn't even edit it. They didn't offer to edit it. So, I phoned around some friends and got them to proofread it. And, you can tell by the cover, I really didn't like this cover. I've hated this cover ever since it came out, which is an awful thing to say. But, the image is okay, but it kind of screams horror. And it's not really entirely a horror novel, I don't feel. But the worst part for me was just the type font. Because that, to me, that's smart art. That's MS Word smart art. And it looks, which is why I was desperate. The minute that the rights to this reverted back to me, I was desperate. So I commissioned my own cover for it, which I personally think, I think that's a bit better. And I re-edited it properly and got it laid out nicely. And, it's a much nicer looking book. So I would also say, if you do want to read this book, if I haven't completely put you off reading this book by now, and I have been trying, I would go with this version. It's better edited and it looks nicer. But yeah, I haven't read this book in many, many years. I don't think it's bad. People who've read it said it gave them nightmares, which is a good thing. I was aiming for that. So I tend to not promote my backlist. So my backlist is Lucy, Angarichna and Georgie, and I'm going to talk about those in order. I tend not to advertise those because they were my first attempts. Those were the days when I was trying to figure out what to write about, how to write about it, whether I could write, what my voice was like, what my style should be, and that was me experimenting playfully with the written word. So I'm not ashamed of them, but I don't go out of my way to promote them either. Just their early works, and every author shivers a little bit at the thought of their backlist, at the things they would have maybe done differently or written differently. But you don't spend a lot of time dwelling on it because there's always the next book to go and write. Anyway, I have rambled on for far too long. The story, let me read you the back blurb. Every night we go to sleep and dream. But what if dreams could wake in our world? Oliver Ryan suffers from sleep paralysis. It's so bad that he's afraid to invite anyone home in case he wakes screaming, or worse. His dreams are so vivid they feel more real than his waking life. Each night he visits the Church of Shattered Hopes, where people cry blood, watches helplessly as horses devour themselves, or shoots himself through the head because a Hollywood star told him to. His salvation appears to lie in Welsh witchcraft and psychoactive drugs, yet they also open the door to a world far worse than he could have imagined. What does the brutal killing of a young girl in 1968 have to do with the recovery of a local coma victim? Ollie is unwittingly thrown into the role of detective. I mean, with a name like Oliver Ryan, of course you're going to be a detective, aren't you? I did get a lot better at naming characters. So yeah, anyway, that's the book. Yeah, my first ever novel. Read it or don't. If you do, pick up the newer version, not the older version. And bear in mind, it was the test run of a someday would-be potentially aspiring author. Okay, and yeah, so let me know, if you're an author, let me know what your first ever novel was about. Let me know in the comments below. Tell me what you learned from writing your first novel.